Good evening and welcome to everyone. My name is Oren. I'm one of the co-founders of Gate 48. I think most of you know us. If not, we are a group of critical Israelis in the Netherlands. We started off in 2007, so next year we're hoping to celebrate 10 years of activism in the Netherlands. These evenings always make us really happy because we see so many new faces. So really happy to see people that we know, but also people that we never saw at one of our events. So Gate 48, together with the Solidaire project of Barak Alir, are organizing this event. Some people had some questions about this weird name and what kind of project it is. But it is a research project at the University of Amsterdam. It stands for the Social Life of State Deportation Regimes. Unfortunately, Barak couldn't be here, but he invited Oren and Yiftachel, our guest of honor tonight, to speak also at the university and also with his students. So we're very happy to have Professor Oren Yiftachel here with us tonight. I'll introduce him a bit. I think perhaps most of you already have an idea about what he's doing. And then I'll give him the floor. And of course, we'll have a lecture of about 40 minutes. And after that, we will have time for Q&A, obviously. So Professor Yiftachel teaches urban studies and political geography at the Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba, Israel, south of Israel. His research is focused, and I'm quoting him from the bio, focused on critical understanding of the relations between space, power, and conflict, with particular attention to ethnic, social, and urban aspects of these relations. Oren has also worked, importantly, for quite some activist organization, human rights and civil society organizations, including the Council for Unrecognized Bedouin Villages, ADVA, the Center for Social Equality, the Israeli Social Protest Movement, and as chair of B'Tselem, monitoring human rights violations in Palestinian territories. Most recently, he has co-founded the Two States and One Homeland peace movement, promoting an Israeli-Palestinian Confederation Union, and I think he will say something more about this tonight. Besides, in a recent article in Haaretz, just really recent, he calls the Israeli left to get with the program, which is my interpretation, and call the situation as it is. No longer an occupation, but an actual apartheid, a situation which can never be legal, as sometimes occupation could be, but a grave misword international crime, where there's no difference to be made anymore between democracy here in Israeli space and occupation there in Palestinian territories. And I think he will speak more about these ideas tonight, and also about possible future scenarios concerning what he calls a struggle of the same homeland, that lies in the context of the massive failures of multiple peace efforts that we, of course, have seen in the last decades. So, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Oren.
Thank you. Which one of the microphones is?
Both of them.
Okay. Thank you very much, Arella, and the people at Gate 48. Bab Tamanyo Arwain, which is a name that we added to it today, which will be quite a thing appropriate. I'm glad to be here, and I think beyond the academic endeavors that were very intense and interesting in the University of Amsterdam, I think, and perhaps equally and even more importantly, is what's happening on the land in terms of our life, the politics, the future, which is sliding. It's sliding and it's endangering both the Palestinians, which is quite well known, but it's also endangering the Jewish side, which in the illusion of democracy and power is sometimes oblivious to what's happening, which I call it the process of creeping apartheid. And I think it's very critical that as all of these kind of regimes around the world, whether it was Serbia or Northern Ireland or South Africa, that international community gets into action, because usually it takes both internal and external forces to change a situation like this. And I will try to show it to you in some of my argument in my lecture today, but also to preface it as a very important time juncture in history where Europe, which actually unwillingly perhaps created the Palestinian problem, has to flex its muscle to resolve the Palestinian and the Jewish problem together. And it's not, of course, Europe's responsibility alone, but it has a pivotal role, historical and moral role, and at the moment it's doing very, very little, and in fact could even be compliant to the crimes that are happening in Israel-Palestine. So with putting that up front, let's try and convince you that what I'm saying actually has some currency. So I titled the lecture, The Political Geography, Israel-Palestine, Apartheid or Confederation, Projecting to the Future, putting those two maps there, on the left, Palestinian emblem of the homeland, on the right, the Jewish emblem, and what is striking already that it is the same homeland. And, you know, it's, except the ear of the Golan, yeah, but nonetheless overlapping attachment, histories, belongings, and aspirations over the same homeland, the same territory. And this is quite rare in ethnic conflicts around the world. Usually it's over part of the homeland, and this is a total kind of coexistence. And I think this is why, we'll see at the end, we think that to get to the root of it and to try and mobilize a program that has a possibility of both Palestinians and Jews supporting it, and also some political feasibility, we have to consider and not ignore this attachment to the homeland of Jews and Palestinians, and yet also not ignore the right of both nations to self-determination. And this is why we started this movement, two states, one homeland, which is a type of union or confederation for Israel-Palestine, as a possibility first to imagine, articulate, and then also to break out of the deadlock that is at the moment taking us all down towards an apartheid regime, yet undeclared, but very much the situation on the ground, and I will elaborate on this. So we're getting some currency. We've been working for 3 years. We have about 700 members, Palestinians and Israelis, and recently we had a big article in the BBC. So I put that a couple of weeks ago, and you see on the right mentioning and some of the members, and it goes over quite a few stages. And we'll return to it at the end. Just about myself, I've been doing a lot of research both internationally and on Israel-Palestine, some of the books that I've done in recent times, including the book Ethnocracy, and recently with Harvard University Press, the issue of indigenous injustice with Ahmad Amara and Ismail Abu Saad, which is, you'll see, is connected to the argument and to the way I think we need to look at this conflict. Not only is conflict between two national movements, not only is conflict between two classes, but conflict between indigenous people and a settler society. And this is what this book is about indigeneity and settler societies. And also, as Arela mentioned, some of my work in human rights organization, I edited and wrote quite a few of these reports for B'Tselem, a lot about the land, the settlement, and the situation in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's all online, and everybody is, it's accessible to everybody. So let's get into the heart of the lecture. Just a year and a half ago, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, claimed that the UN...
He's not the president of the Palestinian Authority, that's Abdelaziz Bourne.
I missed that comment, but let's continue. Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, said in the UN, in a very historical date, we remain steadfast in our goal to declare a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza alongside Israel. Netanyahu, after the recent election, after he wavered a bit and sort of let slip that he thinks there will never be a Palestinian state, suddenly he returned 2 or 3 days after the election and he said, we stand firm behind our commitment for 2 states, for 2 people. So you might ask if leaders of the 2 national movements agree, and it's also in compliance with international law, with the European Union, with all international decisions, with the Arab League, with the Saudi initiative. Why isn't it happening, right? And this is very much the question that I want to try and answer to. Why isn't a two-state solution happening in Israel-Palestine? Which is so obviously, and everybody thinks so obviously, this is what is the only solution. And I think it's not the only solution. The reason it is not happening since the beginning of Zionism, and maybe you can say since the partition plan in 1947, since the 67 war, and all the efforts in the last 25 years, it actually means something about the root causes of this conflict that have been misread and ignored, and therefore, of course, don't lend themselves to the solution. Why has Israel added, since these statements, a year and a half ago, 60,000 settlers to the West Bank? Why has it nationalized more land against international law? It's part of an international crime. Why has it destroyed big parts of Gaza? If it's so obvious that the two-state solution is coming. And equally, why is Palestinian resistance and terror continuing against Israel? Right? If it's so obvious and everybody agrees the two-state solution is just around the corner, because it is not. And in the lecture, I want to examine that puzzle and to argue that there are four important elements, at least, structural elements that prevent this from happening. First and foremost, it's the process of colonization. Because Israel is a colonial project, and unless we discover it, treat it, and try to decolonize it, there will be no end to the conflict. Because it's not a normal conflict like between Belgium and Holland, or between Germany and France. It's not two nations that vie over a border route or something. It's much more fundamental than that, because it's the same homeland. Additionally, the world compliance and European compliance adds to the failure of the two-state solution. The nature of capitalism on our land and the way it's been working itself out in the last 30 years of neoliberal revolution is also adding a lot to the tension, the conflict within the population, makes a solution even further. And Palestinian terror and also Israeli terror is also another very important factor that affects psychologically, affect identities and continuing to hamper solutions. So these are the four elements that I want to very quickly elaborate on. And to add what I already said, that it's misrepresenting the situation to just call it the Israel-Palestine conflict. We have to think about it as a colonial project, as an apartheid in the making, and to call a spade a spade. This is what is actually happening, and I will illustrate it to you. And the very dangerous process of creeping apartheid. Why is it dangerous even more than in South Africa? Because it's happening on the ground. I will show it to you very vividly. Yet it's not declared. Everybody is ignoring it. Everybody is turning a blind eye, saying we are the only democracy in the Middle East, even though every aspect of democracy doesn't happen in Israel. Right? There's no equal citizenship. There's no universal elections or free elections. There's no human rights to everybody. There's no sovereignty to the people under the regime. It's obvious to anybody who actually see that the situation is very different, and yet people turn a blind eye. As Rosa Luxemburg famously taught us, in order to actually create radical change, first and foremost you have to call things in the true names. This is the beginning, and we haven't been doing that. And in the new movement that we have, the two states, one homeland, that is calling for an Israel-Palestine union, we don't have a magic formula, of course, but I think we are addressing those kind of issues in a more genuine, more moral, and also more practical way. And hopefully it will resonate with you as well. So let's look briefly at some of these forces. Colonization, a major one. I'm just having some images that you see all the time. There are 600,000 Jews now that have settled over the border between the imagined border or the international border, what's supposed to be the border, the green line. And this is a huge amount that no state, even if it will, couldn't evacuate, let alone an Israeli state that now more or less openly declares that it has a claim for the entire West Bank to be under Israeli sovereignty. So this will continue. It's actually accelerating. But colonization also occurs inside Israel. The Judaization project is happening all the time. In most Palestinian cities inside Israel, there are new Jewish settlements. In the periphery, in the Negev and the Galil, there's dozens of new settlements. There's new farmlands, there's new land appropriation. The Palestinians in Israel that are 18% of the population control only 3% of the land. So think about this as very much a situation which is hampering coexistence even inside Israel, where the Palestinians are citizens, let alone in the West Bank, where it's openly expansionist project. There's many manifestations for this. One obvious one is the different roads, and now also different buses for Jews and Palestinians. You see these signs when you go into the West Bank everywhere that this road is for Israelis only. And if you are interested in the details, as you drive along, perhaps at 80 or 90 kilometers per hour, you can actually read that Israeli means citizens of Israel and those people who are entitled to the law of return, right? That means any Jew around the world can drive on this road, but the Palestinians that live there cannot drive on it. And with a lot of legal battles, sometimes like roads 443 that you probably know between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which is one of these roads, the Palestinians got the right to enter about 20% of it, on little sections of it, and the road is, in the main, is remained blocked. And of course, many other separations, or the idea of separate and unequal, are on the ground. Everybody can see that. The other thing is compliance. It's soft and sophisticated compliance. I mean, most people condemn Israel, most governments condemn Israel. This is just Cameron's recent statement that condemns softly Israel about what's happening in the territories and what's happening in East Jerusalem. John Kerry, yesterday I think, said about the same and the new project that it's unhelpful for peace, right? This has been going on now for almost 50 years. This is basically lip service to some kind of international law and allowing Israel, propping Israel, selling arms to Israel, allowing Israel to continue in a blatant colonization process. And yet at the same time, for example, Europe is preventing Morocco from getting any privilege, any scientific grounds, any connection to Europe because of West Sahara, which is a less obvious colonization process, similar, and Israel is not prevented from any benefits. And I'll give you something even more stark. What did Russia do last year? It conquered a small piece of land in Crimea that had mostly Russian population and had a referendum. And after the referendum, annexed it against international law. And immediately it got sanctioned. Russian economy is suffering now under sanctions, right? Now Israel has captured Jerusalem, the city of all cities, the cities that billions of people see as the most important, both Muslims and Christians. And it's 50 years that it controls East Jerusalem illegally, and Israel is still free of any serious international pressure about it. So just look at the big Russia and Israel in its treatment by the international community and see what the exceptional state of Israel and the compliance of the international community about that. Now you can think about why it's happened. The Holocaust, of course, it's a bleeding and terrible memory and should remain that way. And the special case of Israel, I think Israel needs to be a safe state. I don't at all think that it's not. But there is a big difference between being safe in Israel and committing all these illegal acts and international crimes that is not really answered by any international pressure. Then there is the issue of capitalism, which I'll not elaborate too much about it, but Israel is among the worst in the OECD in gaps between rich and poor. And as you see on the right there, it's actually the second fastest growing gaps and the third after Mexico and the United States in the gaps between the classes, and the classes in Israel are very ethnic. The lower classes are mostly Arabs and also ultra-Orthodox Jews, and the other Jews are. So this actually exacerbates, and this statistic don't even count big part of the Israeli economy, which is the West Bank, that is under the shekel and under the Israeli laws, and Israel controls all the export and imports and labor. So if we look at Israel and the West Bank, look at this graph up to 2010. The blue is the GDP per capita in Israel, and the brown is in the West Bank. And you see what enormous gaps are creating between the Jews and the Palestinians, very much on the same piece of land. So the economy is playing a big part in incredibly growing tensions between people who the Israelis are part of the international community, very successful. Israel should be proud of its economy, but nonetheless, the Palestinians who are under the same economic regime are blocked from participating in this economy. I'll skip that. And the fourth structural factor is violence and terror. And quite often in analysis, critical left analysis of Israel-Palestine, this is forgotten. But I think the choice of some Palestinian groups to continue and use terror is a big part in the problems that the establishment of the sovereign Palestinian state is happening. It's not the main part, but it has been a resounding failure, not to mention its human rights cost, and not to mention the fact that Israel is also using counter-terror as a state. And what Israel has been doing in Gaza in the last 3 operations, or in Lebanon, raising whole neighborhoods, collective punishments, it's also a reaction to Palestinian terror. And this is where the map on the left is the Hamas bombing, and in the last summer where it reached actually Tel Aviv and the airport, and also Beersheba. And the incredible number of casualties also in Gaza, and the whole discourse around it is very problematic, and this is some of the pictures from Gaza from the last operation. So terror is the fourth factor, if I'm taking a very, very broad-eyed view of what's happening and why the two-state solutions are not happening. But I want to return to my first point is about colonization. And to look at how Israel-Palestine has progressed in 6 main stages, historical, geographical stages. And to see how it's actually quite similar to other settler colonial societies. Surely some of there are differences. Surely the Jews are not the British Empire or the French Empire, not even the Dutch Empire, right? But nonetheless, for the Palestinians, the people that came from outside the land and claimed it, appropriated it, settled it, and pushed the Palestinian out, it's the main factor on the ground. So for the first half of the 20th century, I call it colonization of refugees. Jews are more or less been driven into the homeland. Right? They're driven out of Europe, they're driven out of the Arab world into the homeland. And this is a whole story that a lot of you know. Before the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, a nationalist revolution in the Arab world, Jews are forced almost to go into the homeland and colonize it. Up to 48, it's a different story to some extent. And then in 48, 49, we have the Nakba. We have a process of what we call today ethnic cleansing. It's very important, and not anything that should be forgotten or glossed over. And I'm glad this place is called Gate 48, because every Palestinian or every person that seriously wants to address the relation between Jews and Palestinians has to address 1948. It is a major point in history. As you see, it changed the geography, it changed the demography, and it continues to bleed. In many aspects of society, 48 is still alive. Now I'm working, for example, in the last 10 years with a Bedouin society in the south, and half of this society still doesn't have water, roads, schools, electricity. They're unrecognized because of events that began in 1948. And then in the period of 18 years that Israel was a sovereign state within the Green Line, which is internationally organized, there was a period of internal colonization, where Jews built about 750 settlements, mainly in the Galilee, in the Negev, in the Jerusalem area, and settled the land in the sovereign area, which is legal. But nonetheless, it had an effect on the refugee land, on the Palestinian minority, and it also created tension inside Israel between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, something perhaps for another lecture, but a lot of the geography and settlement inside Israel created social relations that are still active today. And then from 68, after the 6 Days War till 1993, there was the major push to settle the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinian territory. Israel built about 120 new settlements. But when we look now that in 1995, there's only 150,000 settlements and settlers, and now there's 600,000, we see how much easier the situation was then. But nonetheless, that was the major fourth stage. Now in 1993, with the Oslo Agreement, and until about 1995, there was a period, a very short period, that heralded, theoretically, the decolonization. And perhaps a situation that could be resolved. It was very short-lived. Israel didn't actually decolonize didn't take down any settlement. That happened 10 years later from Gaza. But it did retreat the army from the main Palestinian cities and created the enclaves that currently the Palestinian Authority rules over, or semi-rules over. And then this fell by the wayside, especially with the assassination of Rabin, immediately after the election of the Israeli right back into power, which more or less, with one small break of a year and a half, has been in power since then, since 1996. So we're coming now to 30 years of right-wing control over Israel, and right-wing in colonialism, not just right-wing. It has an agenda to colonize and to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. The Likud, the main government, in its charter, anybody can see it on the internet, it says there shall never be a second state between the Jordan and the sea. This is the ruling party in Israel. And then from 1995, with the disengagement from Gaza, Israel retreated partially, retreated also from Lebanon, and I think the Israeli colonialism has reached its boundaries. Israel itself has become more pragmatic and more aware of its ability to have a particular control of a particular territory, and what it does now, it consolidates this control in all various tactics. It consolidates the control of the Jews between the Jordan and the sea, no longer in Lebanon, no longer in Sinai, no longer even in Gaza, but continuing to colonize the main Palestinian territory. So overall, as I'll show you in a minute in terms of citizenship, it creates a creeping apartheid situation where different classes of people have different types of citizenship under the same regime, very much separate and unequal. And I'll elaborate a little bit more in a minute. So let's look at it a little bit. After all, I'm a geographer, so I want to show you a little bit how the maps play into it. First of all, mental colonization. In any government offices, in any schools, in any publication, any advertisement in the paper, any logos, you see all the time Israel is synonymous to the territory between the Jordan and the sea. That is, Israel and Palestine together is called Israel by the Israelis. And this, of course, is a mental kind of colonization. Most young people don't even know where the green line is. And in all official maps in Israel, you're not allowed to put the green line. It's a government decision in the late 60s. So the green line, which is an international border, disappeared. Imagine all maps of Benelux for Dutch students called Holland. No Belgium, no Luxembourg there, and no borders, and it's all called Holland. I know a lot of Dutch people would like that, and there's a history of Dutch people controlling Belgium, but this is what's happening now and everywhere you go. Just in the last election, they caught Netanyahu, casting a vote, and you see the map behind him. It says Israel between the Jordan and the sea. Even Haaretz, a more left-wing newspaper, more liberal newspaper, published this map after the election, which showing all the Israeli parties all over the land, and similar posters and official publications. Now, what's interesting is the Palestinians have a similar, they don't have the same power position, but they have the same cartographic imagination. So you see all the official logos and symbols of the Palestinian organization, like Tanzim al-Tahrir Palestine, the Organization for the Liberation of Palestine, which Abbas is the head, has also the whole land. It doesn't say the West Bank and Gaza. And also Hamas, that emphasizes much more religion with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and of course the swords showing its orientation, but nonetheless it has a map there, green map of the whole of Palestine, Israel, Palestine being Palestine. So I want to impress on you not only its mental colonialism, which it does happen, it also is mental imagination of the weak, which is very, very powerful. Now let's give you a little bit of a moving picture about how the land has been colonized. Because whenever I say that this is a colonial project, people say, what do you mean? The British were colonial, the French were colonial, the Italian were colonial, but the Israelis are not colonial. What is colonization? Is taking over land and settling it, taking it over sometimes violently, sometimes economically, exploiting it. So I'll show you, and you'll judge for yourself. In 1871, which was an Ottoman census, only 3% of the land population was Jewish, concentrated in several small settlements, especially urban.
Including Gaza.
Yeah, in Gaza too. Yeah, it's later on became Gaza. Yeah. Now in 1917, there's already 71 Jewish settlements. Some of the kibbutzim, some of the early Zionist settlements, some of the old yeshuvot, what we call. But still in 1917, it's only 7% of the population is Jewish, right? And something like 1% of the land. This is already 20 years after Zionism. The big push to Zionism, as you know, was the British rule. The British rule paved the way through legislation, through the Balfour Declaration, through international law. Because the Jews have the right for self-determination based on the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations. So that was massive, and of course the anti-Semitism in Europe, massive development. And we see 330 settlements in 1947, with the Jews already constituting a third of the population. So they jumped from 7% to a third of the population in 1947. And then the 48 war, the Nakba, the independence, and after that we see that Israel takes control, and the period of internal colonization, we have 750 settlements. And as we said, look at the major settlement effort, mainly in the north and the south, in the Jerusalem areas, all the areas from which the Palestinian refugees fled. So you see in the north, in the south, and in the east. And this is 1967. And then later on, after the second period, where we said external colonization, Israel settles the West Bank and Gaza in a big way. And these are all what now in Israel they call authorized settlements. We have unauthorized settlements, which are called ma'achazim in Hebrew, or outposts in English. But these are all authorized settlements that the government gave support. And in 1993, this is the situation. And if we continue further, 2015, we see extra 100 unauthorized settlements, which of course Ariel Sharon, as a prime minister, encouraged the people and said, go and settle the hills. Israel is actually, and we must know that Israel has retreated from Gaza. For the first time, it actually dismantled Jewish settlements in one part of the land of Israel for tactical reasons, for whatever is as international relations, but it should be noted. So overall now we have 1,100 Jewish settlements, the largest number of settlements per capita in the world, and Israel is continuing to settle. Just recently they announced 5 new settlements in the Negev, and this is a colonial mindset. It's not the whole of society, it's part of society, but it's a big apparatus, land settlement apparatus, continue to be connected to the military, and with a huge project still happening. Now, the mirror image of that is the Palestinian settlements. So without great elaboration, I'll just let the pictures speak for themselves, the maps speak for themselves. 700 settlements, including 11 towns in 1871. Then in 1917 we have 15 towns, something like 800 settlements. You see spreading because of the new land laws that the Ottomans introduced. Palestinians actually settled new parts of the land. And in 1947 we have 950 Palestinian settlements, 18 cities, and a society that in its own eyes, and according to the rules of the British mandate, was ready to be independent, just like the other states that were decolonizing at the time. But of course that didn't happen, and you see that in 1960, you see the next stage is that the massive destruction and eviction of Palestinians from many parts that became Israel. And we must remember that all the refugees at the moment have remained refugees. They all come from what is Israel. They don't come from the West Bank and Gaza. They all come from Israel proper. And this is a major injury and a bleeding wound that has to be addressed in any effort for the future. Now, from 1967, or basically from 1948, the Palestinian geography has remained stable, static. Very, very, very little. Israel has allowed about 20 new Palestinian settlements. This is the moment they were from 950, it went down to 500. At the moment there's about 520. And most of the only new Arab settlements are for Bedouins that the state is trying to urbanize. Other than that, not even one new settlement that the Palestinians have initiated and has been allowed to take place. So this is a frozen kind of geography, very much controlled. And what you can see is that it's becoming more urbanized, the settlements grow, the demography grows, but in the same geography. This is why many Palestinians feel they live in enclaves, ghettos, some when they say open air prison, because there is no possibility of expansion, because the side that is expanding is the Jewish side. And now when we do both, you see the picture together. 1871, the red is Jewish, the green is the Palestinians, and 1917 a few more Jews, still only 7% of the population. 1947 much more, already after the Holocaust, and already the Jews for the right for self-determination. And in 1967 you see this happening, and then the Jews start to settle over the Green Line, over the state borders, and in 2015 we have the two intertwined populations. 1.6 million Palestinians inside Israel, 600,000 Jews inside what's supposed to be Palestine, and population geography that is very difficult to imagine as being broken into two states for two nations, which is the slogan that people keep mentioning as a solution for Israel-Palestine. So this series of maps that I was helped by some of my students doing that. I mean, I cannot take the credit, but it shows very powerfully both the way this land has been colonized and continues to be colonized, but it also shows that the two-state solution, as is imagined, as the saying in Israel, we are here and they are there, is impractical. It's impractical and perhaps even unjust. And if we take the example of Gaza, which is a mini kind of experiment, it failed miserably. Because the state, Palestinian state, if by any sort of miracle will be created now, it will be an isolated, enclaved, weak, poor state, will be surrounded by Israeli security, and will be a new Gaza. The situation will be a continuation of the conflict, rather than, or maybe a respite, but not genuine peace that can happen between two states. So this is the geography and the experience of Gaza, I think, shows that the traditional two-state solution is not recommended, not just, and impractical at the moment. And this is the map as it happens now in terms of land. You see on the left, the white areas are land that has been Judaized, that is registered as Jewish land, whether Israeli or Jewish. And you see the green enclaves as being the Palestinian land, dark green in the West Bank and Gaza, light green inside Israel. And as you see on the right, we already talked about the 1100 localities, etc., but you'll see that Jewish land covers 85% of the landmass area between the Jordan and the sea. Now the Jews are about 50% of the population, they control 85% of the land. The Palestinians are about 50% of the population, they control 15% of the land. The Palestinians inside Israel are 18% of the population, as I said, and control 3% of the land. This is unsustainable, unequal. And when you think about the process that many of these lands belong to the Palestinians until a few decades ago, it's not only the inequality, but the process of appropriation that make this colonial situation unstable. It also resembles very much the situation that was in South Africa. And this is my last sort of argument. So you see these two maps together, Israel-Palestine now, and the Palestinian enclaves covering 15% of the land, and the black Bantustans until 1992 in South Africa covered 13% of the land. So it's very similar in terms of geography. Of course, the black population was larger, it was about 80%, and the Palestinians about 50%, but the economic gaps, the geography of enclave, the prohibitions of movement, the stripping of political rights. I mean, Palestinians don't have political rights to vote about the government that controls them, which is the Israeli government, which is similar to the black population in South Africa. And in between the two populations, we actually have the Palestinians in Israel that do have political rights. So what I say that, and I'll skip it to the next slide, the process that I call creeping apartheid is expressed in this graph here, in this chart. So what we actually have is the forces I was talking about before. Colonization, global compliance, resistance and terror, and capitalist neoliberalism. They actually create, through violence, through law, through land, through economy, through politics, three basic types of citizenship, which means the package of rights and powers that a person has under a government. White, colored, and black, and recently also foreign. But the three basic ones, the Jews are under white, full citizenship on all the land, wherever they are, in the West Bank or in Israel, wherever they are. The colors are the Palestinians in Israel. They have partial rights. They're better off than the Palestinians in the territories, but they don't have full rights, but they have some kind of political representation. And the black population, in inverted comma, are the Palestinians that are disenfranchised. They don't have representation in the Israeli regime. They have some access to the Israeli courts. They're totally controlling their birth, death, access, mobility, labor, and yet they're considered to be in their own sort of independent, like the Palestinian Authority, like that has a president and a flag and everything, very much like some of the Bantustans have. It's not identical to the Bantustans, but it's not dissimilar. And I put the foreign there because Israel has something between 400,000 and 500,000 people that are neither Arab nor Jews now, that are foreign labor, asylum seekers, that are a big part of our economy now, and perhaps emerging as a fourth type of citizenship. So this is creeping apartheid, this is endangering our society, this creates a lot of tension, this doesn't have the conflict resolution mechanism that democracy has, that everybody has representation, and basically we swap violence to debates in the parliament or in the courts. A lot of big population in Israel, more than half of the population don't have political representation. We have, for all intents and purposes, we're close to minority rule, and we cannot ignore it. So what do? So there's two parts to the end of ending this lecture is what you can do and what we're doing. Okay, under this unbearable situation, what can the EU and Holland do? And basically not accept this situation and try to mobilize against what is basically something that Europe has a lot of historical responsibility. And in an unkind way, Europe is reminded in the last year that it's not at all disconnected from the Middle East and from the conflict. And that is through terror and through refugees, and there's responsibility also for the people of Europe to help what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East to stabilize the situation. Obviously facilitate dialogue, conferences, this is what we're doing here. Retract privileges, I already talked about Morocco that has lost its privileges. I'm not even talking about sanctions, but privileges that Israel has, that very few other countries outside the European Union get. Change the discourse. We must call spade spade. We must look at what's happening and call it by its name. And as we said, military occupation quite often can be legal. If it has the right international relations, and if it has the right international decision, and if it's temporary, it can be legal. But what's happening in Israel, Palestine is no longer occupation. Occupation is military, it's external, and it's temporary under any law that you open. And yet, the Israeli control of the West Bank is almost the opposite. It's become civil, right? It's internal to Israel because the West Bank settlers are part of the Israeli politics and part of the government, right? And it's permanent. Nobody's going anywhere. So the language has to change. And the language of colonialism and apartheid, it's not only better in terms of morality, it's not in terms of politics, it is better, but it's also more accurate. And in the name of accuracy, in the name of actually reflecting what's happening, it has to be called that way. Now, I've been doing it for the last 10 years. I've received a lot of abuse on that, but I maintain to a lot of people, prove me wrong. Don't call me names, prove me wrong. And the discourse has to change. Just think about women's rights, right? That was ridiculed when women wanted to change the discourse and change their rights. The term sexual harassment, it just came in the last 2 decades or whatever, and also revolutionized a lot of the equality between men and women. The same here. I think we have to stick to discourse that will have resonance on the ground, but also has a political potential to change the situation. So EU can start, Holland can start that. Why doesn't the city of Amsterdam declare that they think Israel has an apartheid control over the Palestinians? After all, apartheid comes from Dutch, right? So you know the meaning. And this is where, and that could lead later to what Europe does so well. You know that Europe imposes sanctions on 44 countries around the world? 44 countries, Afghanistan, in Congo, in South America. It is, sometimes it's declaratory, it's not, doesn't have much meaning, but it does mobilize against human rights abuse around the world. Why it doesn't do anything in Israel, Palestine? Not a thing, except perhaps marking the products of the settlements. It took about 10 years, and of course you know that a lot of the production of the settlement has moved its headquarters to Tel Aviv, Netanya, Haifa, and that's reflected now that they're not marked anymore as the West Bank. So this is very, very weak, I think. Influence governments, take a leaf out of Brazil. Brazil has refused now to approve the appointment of an Israeli ambassador that is a settler, right? Now the Israeli government and officials are full of settlers. They're international criminals. They run every day of their life against international law, some of the ministers. That easily can cause a lot of it. Because Israel is such a globalized society and is so connected around the world, it's so important for Israelis. Some of these symbolic, semi-symbolic measures resonate. They have a lot of news about them. And I think that can be done. And protect human rights organizations. This is something quite close to my bone. There's a strong attack against human rights organizations. And very little is heard in their protection that actually carry out much of the ideology and practices that Europe preaches for the world. That's what I said before, City of Amsterdam, even some declarations about the situation can cause some pressure on Israel. Unions, students, action, and public events to support the Israel-Palestine Union. And now for the last 5 minutes, the last 5 more minutes, I'll talk about our movement. 2 states, 1 homeland. And I've got some brochures here for people who are interested. You're welcome to come and fetch some afterwards in here. So what we try to do, a group of us, but already 10 years ago we realized the two-state solution is dead in its original form: separation between Israeli and Palestinians, hard borders, two separate entities, because of all that I showed to you, and because the more we see about the conditions that Israel will put on such a Palestinian state, it will not be viable. And there is no way to make the situation so it will be viable, because Israel will not give up control over the seas, over the Jordan, over the airports, over entries and exits. It's failed time and again. On the other hand, the alternative agenda, which has risen in the last decade, of one-state solution, also we think has major problems. And first and foremost, it's apolitical. It's apolitical because it runs against basic international law and the basic right of Israel to remain a state. And no Israelis, or very, very few Israelis, would say, well, we'll create a new state. And no one state in the world really would agree to merge with another state and change its identity. And in that respect, the one-state solution doesn't have a political field to work with. So we thought that you have the shared homelands, but you have two states, and you have to work with these two fundamental points of departure to make it going along international law, not breaking the rules, making people, leaders and movements able to actually promote this agenda, while changing the terms in which the two states will coexist over the one homeland. And to some extent that resembles the ideas of the European Union, which has sovereignties but freedom of movement and some joint institutions. So we have several key points of departure. The one homeland, the whole homeland, is very important for history, for belonging, for attachment, for identity, for both Jews and Palestinians. It's just different periods of history. The Jews have this ancient history there, and because of the circumstances of history, they are returning to their homeland, which is the whole land, and the same with Palestinians, a very recent history on that land, the native people of these lands, and this cannot be wiped away. So this is the one homeland, but the two states is the right of both peoples to have independent sovereign states. So this is where the circle has to be squared. And the idea here that the whole land will have freedom of movement, that is, to some extent, the whole land will belong to the two peoples. So there will be a Palestinian parliament, Palestinian law in Palestine, and an Israeli parliament with Israeli law in Israel, but the people can move, just like the move between Belgium and Holland. And when they're in territory A, they have to abide by the laws of territory A, and when they're in territory B, they're allowed to have to abide by the laws of territory B, but to some extent this frees the enclave, the ghettoization, the feeling of prison, and also the right of return. The right of return is very, very important in Palestinian rhetoric, in Palestinian history, and when they have freedom of movement in the land, to some extent, not to a full extent, but to a great extent, they have a right of return to the regions from where they were evicted.
But they won't get citizenship.
And they get Palestinian citizenship. Palestinian citizenship that they hold to, just like a Dutch person can go to Belgium and be a Dutch citizen and be a resident of Belgium. Right? And there will be also a union kind of membership or citizenship which will hold certain rights, and we think High Court of Human Rights and certain other economic rights that will be valid everywhere. And Jerusalem will be a joint city, not a divided city, joint capital, perhaps some kind of like a Brussels model that is a joint capital with special institutions that will govern it as the quintessential global city, important to all religions especially, but also to very much to Israelis and Palestinians. And the program has received a lot of attention, a lot of support from the right and from the left. It's interesting. For example, one of our supporters is Reuven Rivlin, who is associated with the right, sometimes with an extreme right, but the liberal right in Israel-Palestine. Another one has come in supporting a program is Dov Hanin and some of the communist socialists. So it cuts the spectrum that normally left and right. And also among the Palestinians, there's a lot of interest. Abu Allah, for example, as the previous prime minister said, this is the only practical solution. But yet we are in the beginning. We don't claim to have too much influence yet, but it's growing all the time. And
Palestinians will be able to settle in old land?
so I'll just finish, about 2 more slides. So we envisage it in a couple of stages. In the beginning we have sovereign Palestine, sovereign Israel, and capital region of Jerusalem with some kind of a joint council that will have some responsibilities over environment, over labor migration, over relatively unemotional issues. Like the European Union started with steel and coal, and then it thickened up. And it will have control over the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians. The Israelis will have control over these key groups that might have a multicultural kind of constitution. But then over the years, if it's successful and give us a period of, say, a decade without violence, it can thicken up and become, so the Joint Council will have more responsibilities. Maybe it will have, more ability to shift resources between rich and poor. It will control immigration policy. It will have environmental enforcement and human rights. Sovereign Palestine and sovereign Israel, of course, will become, I think, more decentralized, a bit more multicultural, and hopefully Jerusalem will become what it promises to be, the city of peace and one of the major metropolitan regions of the world, where West meets East and where the mundane every day meets the sacred and divine. So instead of walls that a lot of people, including the Labour Party in Israel, promises us, actually it's, I think, time to start lifting the walls and to finish with that, oh sorry, I'm going backwards. To finish with one of the heroes, tragic heroes of our history, which is Samson, that instead of pushing and destroying the Palestinians and killing him and the others, as happened in the Bible, and this is the thing what's happening now with the expanding Israel, actually say, wait a minute before you destroy. Have you thought about the Palestinian-Israeli Union, which might prevent the destruction of the land and the people? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Oren. I'm sure there will be some questions, so I'll open right away. If you please can keep it short and concise and keep it to a question, not so much a statement. Yes.
Right, so I'll try to keep it short and concise about the form of the question that I can oblige. I think Professor Yiftachel is ignoring in his presentation of the subject and in his vision or his movement's vision the nature of states in general and the dominant states in the world today and in the world of 60 or 70 years ago when Israel was legitimized by the United States and nations. So I'm not going to give a counter lecture on the nature of states, but they are instruments of ruling classes to control populations. They are not controlled by their populaces and do not generally serve their interests. And I think it is kind of interesting that you were giving this lecture at this time, where we see how the European Union, this superstate, has been acting and suppressing the interests of European populations and European peoples in favor of the interests of unelected elites. And in the formation of Israel, these states allowed the Zionist movements to form its own state on about 55% of the land, with a minority of close to 50% Palestinians, which had most of the land then, it was essentially a green light to the carrying out of the ethnic cleansing of that time. So if we ask ourselves how come the US or Europe are looking the other way for the past several decades or for long decades before that, it is because that is essentially what they want. They might want things to be stabler, but this colonial project is their colonial project by proxy. And I think that solutions that are based on international law, international legitimacy, into creation or stabilization of states in Palestine, which integrate into the international community of states, are fundamentally and morally wrong and should not be promoted neither in the short term nor in the long term.
Thank you.
Shall we answer?
Yeah, well, it's a long story. It's a real answer.
Well, I mean, Antonio Gramsci has a long discussion about. Well said, huh?
This is back now.
Antonio Gramsci told us about organic and unorganic and helpful and useless intellectuals, right? And he has a lot of discussion about the intellectuals that remove themselves into the pure realm of ideas and therefore become totally politically irrelevant. He tried to make them relevant against the fascist Italian state. Now, he or others didn't look at states as something taken for granted, something that is absolutely without any change always for the oppression of people. There's a lot of types of states and very different, and I very much object to the idea that the state is one thing. Right? There's a lot of oppression around the world, and there are many states that are successful. So in that respect, your point of departure that all states are bad is A, politically, historically wrong, and also you remove yourself from any possibility of influencing the politics of the time. You can stay whatever you like, sit here, but if you want to influence, you have to engage with the system of power. This is what we're trying to do. And yes, there's a lot of oppression, and yes, there's a lot of success sometimes in overcoming oppression, like you see the decolonizing of 3/4 of the world just 50 or 60 years ago. Now, the EU, I see it all the time and I hear it all the time. There's a lot of discontent about the EU. There are a lot of grievances. But I want to take you, Europeans, 2 or 3 steps back and see what a major achievement the EU is. In historical terms, it's almost a miracle. This was the graveyard of the world. This was where wars were invented, where colonialism was invented, where racism was invented. The EU today, with all its problems, stands for other values. It's not all successful. It has a lot of, issues. Greece, maybe Britain. But think about it. In the long durée, the long period of peace that we exist now is because of this project of the Confederation. It's because the borders were open, because nationalism was weakened, because there is organized economy together. Yes, the elites benefit from it, but the people benefit from it too. And if we get in Israel-Palestine to the major problems that the EU has, and these are the problems that we have, I take it in 2 hands. No violence, freedom of movement, citizenship, human rights, So take it in perspective, and don't think that some crisis, there is in the last year or 2, and there is a crisis. Just think about Germany, the heart of racism that the world hasn't seen before with the Holocaust, is the country now that is taking most of the refugees. Think about how things can change in 60 or 70 years. I'm not naive. I know that this will be exploited by the German economy. I know that Germany needs new, I know that they will not get citizenship for a long time. I know all the problems, right? But think about it in comparative terms and in terms of what was and what is now. And the Confederation or the European Union that is established in the Middle East is a very, very positive development. So I urge you to think a bit historically and a bit politically, and you'll see that not all is black in the world of states, and we try to make it as light as possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe a short question about the kind of recommendations you give to Europeans who want to be influential and intervene in Israel-Palestine. I basically understood that you imply that today Palestine as a state doesn't exist. So there is no Palestinian state, the enclaves are not viable to become Palestinian state as they are today. So I was wondering what's your opinion, what should European Union or member states of the EU should do in regards to, first of all, the economic, the transfer of money to the Palestinian Authority, the propping up of this Palestinian Authority, and also about the recognition of a Palestinian state in the current conditions.
Yeah, well, I think the European Union for a long time has tried to prop, with Tony Blair being the special emissary, and tried to prop through monies the creation of a pseudo kind of, I would say, adolescence kind of, not quite mature Palestinian state, and I think that was the wrong tack to take. Eva Luz wrote an article a couple of years ago about comparing the situation in Israel-Palestine to a slave and a master, right? And Europe has tried to help the slave a bit, give the slave a bit more food, and maybe less working hours, and maybe less weight to carry. But it hasn't treated the master. So the slave will continue to be a slave. There is a package, there is a colonizing situation. Europe has to address Israel, and like any other criminal state, Israel is no exception. And it will be in the benefit of Israel and Israelis. Now, we're too powerful for our own good. And this is, in the long time, creates a disaster for Israel. So just international law in many ways is good for stopping it. It was good for Serbia, it was good for Ireland, it was good for South Africa. It was good for many countries that international law stopped the violation. I think Europe can do it. I think, of course, I don't put the blame on Europe. The number one reason there is apartheid in Israel-Palestine is Israel. Number two is the United States. Israel is part of the American empire. But the number three, perhaps, is Europe. And Europe is the biggest trading partner of Israel. Europe is the historical reason there is a Palestinian problem. There is a historical reason there is a Jewish problem that then deflected into a Palestinian problem. Right? So, and Europe is now suffering some of the boomerang effect. So, I would say it's in your interest, but also very much, I hope, in our interest, that Europe implies its own standards. We don't ask for anything more to Israel-Palestine. Stop colonization, have equality, have freedom for the people that have international rights to have the freedom and self-determination, and I suppose perhaps have an incentive of being very close in the working of the European Union in the benefits that can offer for Israelis and Palestinians.
So the recognition of the Palestinian state in the current...
Well, as I said, I don't think that's a lot of parliaments have recognized Palestine, but it's symbolic, and it's not really addressing the issue. The issue is the colonizer first. Yeah, I would also say, terror, as I said, is a problem, but that's not the core issue. The core issue is Israel's open will to control, colonize, and eventually annex the whole of Palestine.
Okay, I want to take a few questions. So, are there no more questions? Yeah, in the back.
Others.
Others first?
Speak.
Okay, I'll have you in the back and you here, and then maybe depends how long, but at least you keep it short. Yeah.
Oh, well, Mr. Yiftachel, I do not know exactly how to formulate my question.
Can you speak up, please, so you can be heard?
I don't know exactly how to formulate my question. I'm searching how to formulate it. But first there is the analysis, and I, to a high degree, agree with your analysis. And then there is your solution, supposed to counter the analysis. Now, your solution, as far as I see it, depends on the will of the powers that be to implement it. So you can try to find support, but in the end, it will be implemented top-down, not the other way around. I do not see, honestly, any Israeli government or any Israeli elite power to be ready to implement such a solution. That brings me to my question. doubting the possibility that there will come a solution by Israel itself, I would like to defend utmost pressure from the outside on the Israeli state, on the Israeli government, on Israel as a country. Maybe you have worked it into your ideas about what the EU or Dutch could do, but I would like to see, from my point of view, a much more outspoken idea about pressure being brought upon the state of Israel in order to let it pay a price for what is going on. So I would like you to say something about such an idea.
I think you,
I'll just get some.
for someone who didn't know how to formulate the question, it's very beautifully formulated. I'd like to reply, for otherwise I forget. First of all, you're right. You know, the implementation is, there is not a template here how to implement it. But what I tell you, and that's why I stress that there is support for this from the right, not just from the left, is that Israel has a major headache. To some extent, it's caught in its own power. You said we're too powerful for our own good. A lot of Israelis don't want to be colonizers. They don't want apartheid. But they're caught in the situation because of the settlement, because of Jerusalem, and Rabin assassination is a warning sign. No politician after Rabin is willing to do half of what Rabin. They're scared. There is an undeclared civil war inside Israel between very, very well-armed and very organized settlement sphere and its allies and the rest of the population. So what our plan, which I didn't go into all the details, offers to them is a way out. Is a way out because our plan keeps the settlement in their place. Now the nightmare of Israel, the nightmare is to try and evacuate settlements. And if you remember 11 years ago, Israel evacuated 7,000 people, just 7,000 from the Gaza Gush Katif. And it was a whole drama that continues until now. Still, some of the settlers are still in caravans, still claiming the state deserted them, etc. It was a nightmare for 7,000, not for 600,000. Okay? So with some sort of political and geographical manipulation, people say maybe only half will have to evacuate because of the fiction. It's called settlement blocks. It's just a fiction. But even if you go to 300,000, it will tear Israel apart. It's not at all possible. And there will be armed resistance by the settlers themselves. So when in a plan, you say you can stay. And the Palestinians, many of the Palestinians agree to it, because if they get freedom of movement, and if the settlers pay for the land, which they stole, but if they pay the full price for it, and there will be anti-Palestinian sovereignty, first of all, the main colonizing project fails, because it is to prevent Palestinian sovereignty. If there is Palestinian sovereignty, the idea of a colonial rule ends. A lot of settlers will leave. All the surveys that we saying 60-70% of settlers will leave under such conditions, but it's a very different situation where you have the choice or whether you're forced and uprooted. So in that respect, it gives a lot of people from the right, like Rivlin or like Gilad Gamliel, that her voice has support in us, a way out. They said, you have a choice, A, B, or C, we're not evacuating you. If you want to live back into the green line, you can do that. And I think the majority will do it. But in large settlements, especially the ultra-Orthodox, like Beitar Illit or like Pes Ariel and Ma'ale Adumim, where they can have their own council and they all continue their way of life uninterrupted, they will stay because they want their homes and they will not be interrupted. So this is one thing. The other thing is Jerusalem. All Israelis know that the fact that Israel declares day and night that Jerusalem is united and Jewish, they declare it day and night because it's not, right? Normally you don't have to declare something that's obvious, right? I don't declare every day and night that I'm 1 meter 85. Everybody can see that I'm 1 meter 85, right? When you declare day and night, this city is Jewish and Jewish and Jewish, they know that it's not, right? So this united Jerusalem, that will be Jewish and Palestinian, but very much Jewish part of this Jerusalem will stay, and the city will be united, and the holy places will be accessible to the Jews. That's another project of the right. This plan supports, and not that the traditional two-state, which is separation, and the Jews detach themselves for the historical and religious sites. So in some respect, it allows a way out of an impossible situation. For the Palestinians, it's the right of return. No Palestinian leader can give up the right of return. So this, in a way, this kind of union, confederation, freedom of movement is, to a great extent, a right of return, differently to each person coming back to the house, but the space opens to the Palestinians. So in that respect, don't underestimate the political possibilities of a union that allows both the Palestinian right and the Israeli right a way out. And of course, I hope that the left on both sides, that is interested in human rights, democracy, equality, will also support it. So in that respect, it's not so difficult to think that it's not just more moral, but it's more practical and more implementable. And it needs some leaders to actually take it into the political arena, but they could have a lot of success by saying, hey, I have a new plan which is actually more practical, because it basically says, keep this geography, just change the rule. Because at the moment, all the plans are about uprooting and changing the geography, which is a nightmare. This was the situation. About what Europe and the other, I think I spelled it out quite well. It's sanction, it's banning, it's threatening, it's facilitating dialogue, it's all the things that you do to a state that is stepping out of line. It's a criminal state. Why do you do it to Afghanistan, or to Syria, and to Russia, and to Serbia, and to Morocco, and not to Israel? Why? I think the idea of the good Zionism was to be like all other nations. So let's be like all other nations and abide by the international rules. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try to have you two together. Please keep it short. Do you have some other questions?
Many thanks for your presentation. Quite interesting. I was wondering actually if some of the approach you proposed in terms of the Confederation is not going in a radically different direction than what is happening in the region. There is more and more of fragmentation inside the Middle East, inside Syria, inside Iraq. People are coming back around their identity, be it the Kurds, the Arabs, and then of course the sectarian breakdown in Muslim land. So I'm wondering how then you will be able to convince the Arab Palestinians that such a project, which is obviously going quite in a different direction, would be something in which they could find themselves. Whereas they have, internal tensions within the Arab world, which are pushing, on the contrary, to reinforce this common identity, and therefore asking the Arab Palestinians to maybe drop part of their identity in which they hold on to so much and for so long now, more than 60 years, by asking them to get into a confederation which maybe in 10 or 20 years will afford them to have equal rights. I'm wondering if it's really feasible, if you can convince the Arab population that lives in the territories and in Israel that such a solution, even if I agree with you, it's very practical, it's probably the best one. Ideally, it would be the best one because what's going on now, it's not going in the right direction and everybody's losing. But still, how do you think you would be able to convince Arab masses or the Arab Palestinians and the wider Arab population that such a solution would be a guarantee for Palestinians to have their rights upheld, which is really a bit of a core of what they're looking at, particularly in relation, for example, to the right of return. Because, of course, if you set up a confederation, you will have Palestinians that have left in '48, that were pushed out, actually, to come back in areas, I don't know, east of Haifa and towards Al-Qibya, which is the smallest 15 kilometers between the Palestinian lands and the Mediterranean, which is really the area.
Okay, you're going to let Oren
Which
answer,
way
because
is it?
otherwise we really won't have time. I think the idea is clear. Good question. You want to immediately?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, about what's happening in Syria and Iraq, most Palestinians, if you read the press, and most of the Arab people think it's a disaster. They don't want to go there. So if there is a solution that is in another direction, more democratic, more human rights, most people support it. They don't see Syria, the disaster that's happening, as anything to fall. And as you can see, the Arab press, there is incredible opposition to Daesh. How do you say Daesh in Dutch? ISIS, right? So perhaps what you ask can be turned around and say, because it's happening in Syria and it's such a terrible disaster, actually other solutions are more attractive. Now, when you talk to all the Palestinian leaders, and we talk to a lot of the ministers, etc., they say to us, the problem is Israel. like this gentleman said. We will take it, of course. We'll have a state, we'll have freedom of movement. We have to swallow a few frogs, like Jerusalem is also Jewish, half and half, and maybe some of the settlements will stay. But basically, it's a good plan for us. You know, it will get us out of the blockade, out of the siege. We'll be able to integrate into the economy, the right of return. So the Palestinians said this is a good solution, basically, if and I think they're right in this assessment. Now, the Palestinians in Israel too, which is another very important group, are very, very keen. And a lot of their leaders, like Muhammad Barakeh, recently we met with them, they said we'll be the greatest winner of this because we are connected to the Palestinians and to the Israelis. And it's a strong economy and no doubt will benefit from it. So mapping the different groups, yes, there is fragmentation, but as a political fragmentation on the identity level, but as a political project, it's attractive. And one last point is that the Palestinians suffer greatly from the division between Hamas and the Sultan or the Fatah. This is terrible, debilitating. Now, under this plan, it has an ability to bridge, maybe not resolve the issue, but bridge through economic operations, through freedom of movement, through breaking out this kind of division in the Palestinian situation, that the geography, the political geography of this new space will allow a better relation between the Hamas and Fatah. But these are good, very important issues that only time will tell how, but I still think we offer a good solution out of it.
Shall I continue one by one? Is that better?
Yeah.
Or
But,
I don't have enough time, so that's why I want to really ask you to keep it short, the question and answer. Because I have you. Hila, I have a small question. You in the back. Mike, okay, then that's it. And very short, and hopefully we'll get
people told me they close everything early in Amsterdam, right? So we have to be careful when we go
We have
out.
a little bit more time, but
yeah.
We
If
know
you all can
some
do it-
places that keep running.
if you all,
Don't
well, not
worry.
university,
I
if you
wonder.
all can do it short, that would be great. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. We are blocked by technology. I want to say thank you very much for the lecture, and I was curious to ask in your proposal if you think in maintaining a binary solution, you potentially have the problem that within each side somehow you replicate a kind of disenfranchised and privileged parts of the population. And for example, I noticed in the besides Jerusalem, there's still the portrayal of Israel and Palestine as kind of united entities. And I was wondering if there would be potentially another way to approach the territorial self-governance that also addresses kind of very, very mosaic-like pattern of population. So
I think in the long term it's possible. It's possible that this confederation could lead to a federation over time. Like happened in Switzerland or Canada, or places that were confederated, two nations, and it became more of a federation. But I think it's not true that this is a binary kind of solution. I mean, what's on the table in terms of international law is extreme binarism. Palestinian self-determination, Israeli self-determination, close borders between them, etc., etc. And this has a lot of other bridges. First of all, the union will have economic, environmental, whatever institutions that will be joined. Jerusalem will be joined. Freedom of movement will be joined. I'm sure a lot of economic activity will be joined. The danger exists because it's still a capitalist system that the gaps will remain very high. Like I showed you in the graph, that the Israeli economy is 20 times stronger than the Palestinians. I think probably logically it will close a little bit, but there is a danger of class tension. But I think of all the possibilities that we have to hold, we cannot wish away rights that exist in international law. You know, if you're a real anarchist, perhaps you say, stuff it, I don't care about the UN, I don't care about international law, I just behave in the world the way I'm, like Daesh, like ISIS do, right? But this is where the project doesn't have an horizon. In this time and in this place, until we have a different political setting, we have to play by the rules, but take them to their limit. And I think Confederation plays by this rule, but reduces in the most possible way, the binarism, which we have to reduce over time.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a more focused question on the land regime, because you are a geographer and you have to give us a little bit of a sense of who will control the land in the Confederation. We know that there are struggles over land within Israeli society. We have privatization of land, we have real estate moguls that control the land, developers, etc. So, and those who suffer from the current land regime within Israel are mostly the weak parts of the population, and gradually also the middle class, the Israeli middle class. So, what's the vision for control over land? Who will control it? How will it be distributed? And how the two populations, the Palestinians and, let's say, the weakest populations in Israel, who a lot of them are sitting on Palestinian land, absentee properties, how do you avoid a clash over land claims?
Well, I think it's a key aspect of, and it's also my expertise totally, so I can give you a 10-hour lecture about the land regime and how it's changed and it's definitely currently very unequal, very unjust, and it's part of the process. We have point 9 to 10 in our manifesto is the whole process of reconciliation through material redistribution. So obviously this has to be done. We have another point about all damages caused by the conflict will be corrected wherever possible without causing new injustices, right? So if someone in good faith purchased land from the Israeli state and the state didn't tell her that it was Palestinian land, that happens quite often, she will not be evicted, but the Palestinian will get the land confiscation in another place, right? And this is where a lot of refugee crises around the world, most notably Bosnia recently, this is the line that they took. Everybody will be compensated. All the people that lost property will, I think rightly so. But the people that are already there also have rights. And in Cyprus recently we have a few very important cases in that respect. And there is no question that beyond the compensation, the restitution, we also have a question of social justice. And that the economy of the Confederation and the two states will have to address that. And so far, on both societies, but especially in Israel, it's totally been neglected. Despite social movement, despite a lot of protests, Israel is becoming one of the worst societies in terms of wild capitalist inequality. And that, again, I think, will be assisted with the colonial conflict calming down a bit and more forces, more political energy towards addressing the class war that exists in Israel. That the very thin layer of very powerful capitalists, through the land system, through the high-tech system, through the financial institution, is daily robbing off our children and the middle and lower classes. So this is something that, you cannot address everything in this, but I think it will help putting the energies into more just redistribution in Israel and I'm sure also in Palestine.
I wanted to go back to your answer to the question of that gentleman. You said when the settlements realized, when the people in the settlements realized that they are going to be under the sovereignty of the Palestinian Authority, that 60 or 70% will go back, will leave. But what about, I think that there's another scenario that you could imagine, which is they realize what's happening, and they say, no, this isn't right, this isn't what I want, and that they mobilize and they take over the apparatus of occupation, and they simply take over the West Bank, right? And Europe isn't going to do anything about it. Israel will not do anything about it. Elements of the United States are going to support it. And what we'll get is a two-state solution, but it will be two Israels instead of the Palestinian Israel. And it sounds absurd, right? But you see how quickly, right, when you have these sharp politicians, like we're having right now, who use nationalist ideology to mobilize, and the infrastructure is already in place from the ground up through the ideology, right? So all that has to happen is for that apparatus to be captured and redeployed.
That's an interesting scenario. I will never call any scenario impossible in our situation. What you say is already happening politically. The colonialist party, which is called the Jewish Home, is openly advancing an agenda to annex big parts of the West Bank, 60% of the West Bank immediately. This is Area C. You just open YouTube, they have the plan. By the way, they call it Tochnit HaHaga'ah. How would you, they call it the calming down, the pacification plan to annex big parts of the West Bank, and then they say the Palestinians will realize that they'll never have a state, and then they will be quiet, right? This is already on the card. This is key ministers, the Minister of Education, Minister of Justice in Israel, they're promoting it. Also parts of the Likud, like our acting Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Tzipi Hotubeli, and very powerful, or at least very vocal Minister of Culture, advocating annexing Miri Regev and Tzipi Hotubeli, leading a charge to annex big parts of the West Bank. So the settlers obviously are behind it, and also they want to get the vote of the settlers. So as you know, this is always a mutual, but it's done through the state. Now the scenario that you say that the settlers secede from the state, I mean, as political geographers, there is Virginia Mandus here, he says, we know that has happened in the past, including, say, Northern Ireland, right? So radical settlers can actually secede from their mother state. For some reason, maybe I don't see it happening in Israel because, first of all, the connection is so strong and they totally rely on the Israeli army. And the Israeli army, still 80% is not settlers. And will not be much more because a lot of the settlers are ultra-Orthodox, they don't go to the army, which is another issue. So they will never have, if we talk now really military analysis, they'll never have enough force to secede from the state. And also there will be open war against the Palestinians who outnumber them by 5-1. So it could be a lot of bloodshed, I agree with you. The first suicide bombing, I remind you, was a Jew, killing 29 Palestinians in the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron in 1994, before all the Hamas started. So it's always a possibility. They assassinated the Prime Minister. There could be an open violent conflict. I don't think they'll have the ability to secede from the Israeli state and control the West Bank. This is my, not because they don't want to, but they just aren't able to. Yeah.
We have two very, very small questions. They promised me with nodding. So I'll take them both. Micah and you.
I have to choose because I have two very short questions. I heard there's a plan to establish a new Palestinian city near Akko. Do you know something about it?
Yeah, Tantor, yeah.
No, I don't know the name, but
it's called Tantor, yeah.
Do you know something?
Yeah, like Makar, yeah. Near Makar, yeah.
And what do Israelis say, where if you talk about the cooperation, about their safety, if there's free movement for everyone?
Well, Tantur is we say in Hebrew a statement that it's called lag larash, like you scorn at the poor. So they try to throw a few crumbs at the Palestinians, and basically the Palestinian city inside Israel is a very good idea. There's a lot of Palestinians that are looking not to live in the traditional society, to urbanize, to mobilize, and they don't have where to. And of course what Israel did in 1948, apart from evicting a lot of the Palestinians, is destroy Palestinian urbanism. Palestine was the most urbanized society in the Middle East. It had Jaffa, it had Haifa, it had Jerusalem, it had very Nazareth thriving cities, and at the moment Palestinian society almost is without urbanism. So I think a city is a good idea, but not the way they propose it, which is a tiny area between the Makar and Deida and the road. And I think the mood now on the Palestinian leaders is, yes, it's a good idea, not there. So this is a detailed question. The other question was about security. Of course, it's a major issue. We commissioned a group of experts from the Herzliya think tank on security, and we have reports about it that they actually think that this is doable security-wise. And a few generals sat in this committee, and they said that if Israel and Palestine control the external borders, controlling the population inside against terrorism is quite easy, so they say. But there will be security issues, no doubt, especially when Gaza will open, as it should open. It should totally open Gaza. The Gazans have the same rights as anybody else. There could be some Hamas people that try to disrupt through terrorism. They've done that in the past. But overall, as we know, terror grows always on some kind of conditions, discontent, oppression, and occupation. And over time, we see all these places where there was extreme terrorism quietens down, the situation calms down. So hopefully, security will not be a big issue.
Yeah, thanks, very quickly. So on one hand, we have Palestinians who can rely on Israeli products because of history of dispossession. So 90% of the products that you can rely on are made in Israel. This is on one end. On the second end, you have money from Israel, from the flourishing economy from Israel, due to the dispossession that I was talking about, that is often buying elite or authorities, Palestinian authorities. And this is linked to what you were calling the monopoly, the expansion of market linked to this colonial expansion. And so I was wondering how in such a monopoly of economy, so economic monopoly, but also warfare monopoly, where the army is just the Israeli army, you can see your very utopian view of having two states in such an environment.
Well, you know, the economic inequalities, as I said, are a major issue, but they're not the issue. They are important, and I think any state or two states or confederation that wants a viable, thriving society will have to address the issue of socioeconomic gaps, and part of it is fighting against the monopolies. I'm not very optimistic about it because capitalism is rooted very strongly. It's corrupt kind of capitalism, both in Israel and in Palestine. But I would like to also add that a lot of the Israeli wealth and economic success is not premised on Palestinian dispossession. Israel should be proud. It has a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of high tech, a lot of other economic development that is not related so much to the conflict. But you're right that part of the economy, especially the military hardware, the surveillance, the spying, and the selling of weapons is related to the conflict. So I think in that respect, if the conflict dies down, some of these activities will weaken. They'll not disappear, they'll weaken. And perhaps other activities that Palestinians will also be able to benefit from will strengthen. I know one professor in our university that all the time studies scenarios about tourism. That at the moment Israel-Palestine, which is incredibly attractive to billions of people around the world because of its history, because of the sacred sites, because of the beautiful landscape. He tells me all the time that Israel and Palestine together have only a fifth of the number of tourists that come to Barcelona alone a year. Okay? So when you relax the situation, for example, tourism industry, I'm sure will be able to thrive for both Palestinians and Israelis. This is just one example of new economies that can flourish without, of course, underestimating the constant danger of the capitalist elites to monopolize everything in their favor. And we have to do politics against it.